Taylor Moore was born February 17, 1933 in Concord, North Carolina to Parker Davis and Flonnie Blanche Kaiser. Parker, also known as PD, would be instrumental in his daughter's views about men and how she resolved emotional conflicts later in life. PD was a millworker and sometimes Baptist minister. Blanche remembered the early years, when her father would preach and how people from miles around would flock to hear his sermons. PD had a gift that seemed to attract both saints and sinners alike. Blanche was the happiest when her father was stable-minded and God-fearing. Unfortunately, there was another side to PD Kaiser, one that was hell-bent on destroying everything around him. He was an unrepentant womanizer and alcoholic who blew through money without a care in the world, even if it meant his children would go hungry. He would constantly open the doors of a church just to have it closed months later because he hadn't paid the rent. Blanche sometimes heard her mother crying in her room with a pillow to her mouth in an effort to not alarm the children, but it was no use. However, women and booze weren't PD's only vices. He also had a gambling addiction that had gotten so bad that he wouldn't come home for weeks at a time until he had the money to pay off the debt. But when Blanche got older, closer to being a woman, he had another idea in mind. She was pretty just like her mother with long dark hair and milky white skin. One afternoon after the family returned home from a leisurely ride through the countryside, PD asked Blanche to go riding with him to the store. He wouldn't let the other children go, just Blanche. But instead of driving to the store, her father turned down a dirt road before coming to a stop. Blanche could see a man standing underneath a tree, someone she had never seen before. PD matter-of-factly told Blanche that he owed the man money, and had promised her to him in exchange for the debt being forgiven. He told her that if she didn't agree to give the man what he wanted, it would put the family in grave danger. He assured her that he would watch to make sure the man didn't hurt her. This violation of innocence scarred Blanche for life. It was also a recurring theme, where she found herself being used as a pawn to pay off her father's gambling debts. Sometimes it would be several times a week as long as he had money to gamble away. But the worst part was having her own father sit around and watch other men repeatedly violate her, then drive her home as if nothing happened. Blanche was too ashamed to tell her mother what was happening out of fear that she wouldn't do anything to protect her. By the time she met James Taylor, she knew she had found a way out. Although his mother and family was suspicious of the beautiful brunette, they knew James needed stability and the 19-year-old Blanche would provide that. After dropping out of school in small-town USA, James hadn't quite found his footing. But Blanche didn't care about anything other than escaping her father for good. Not long after the marriage, Blanche was pregnant and their daughter Vanessa was born the following year. Times were tough for the young family, forcing Blanche to work outside the home. She learned early on that James, like her father PD, was an avid gambler who lost more than he ever won. He was also a drinker, which could change him from a sweet gentle man into a violent drunk in the blink of an eye. His family would have to step in and help the young couple pay their bills and buy food just to keep their lives stable. With her new job as a cashier at a local grocery store, Blanche was able to at least maintain even a small morsel of dignity, even though her resentment for her husband began to fester. But she knew she could never leave him because the Bible spoke against divorce, and the one thing she remained committed to, the one thing connected to her father, was her Christian upbringing. Her only way out of the marriage was till death do them part, and James was healthier than a horse, so the marriage would survive at least for the foreseeable future. But she soon found an outlet that would help her take her mind off her troubles. Raymond Reed was a welcome distraction from Blanche's disastrous marriage. He was a manager at the grocery store where she worked, and the affair was a constant source of gossip. After giving birth to a second daughter, Christine, she returned to work with a new purpose in life. She was desperate to separate herself from merely existing in a doomed marriage, and Raymond Reed had her undivided attention. Blanche knew exactly what to do to ensnare a man, and Reed was no exception. He couldn't resist her seductive attempts, and pretty soon, he was completely in lust with the beautiful brunette with the dark sensual eyes that seemed to penetrate his soul. Never mind the fact that he, like Blanche, was married with a young family. Although she liked to keep up the pretense of being a meek and humble wife and mother who liked to recite Bible verses and sing hymns to customers in her checkout line, there was another side to her, a woman who would talk openly about her preferences in the bedroom. Her favorite topic was oral sex, and, if her chatter was any indication of her inhibitions in the bedroom, it was no wonder Raymond Reed was hooked. So much so that he eventually would leave his wife for Blanche. But she couldn't bring herself to do the same. Even though she was clearly committing adultery, for whatever reason, she could never go through with a divorce. Perhaps it was seeing how devastating it was to her mother Flonnie when PD left her for another woman. Even after all the womanizing, the drinking, and the gambling, the heaviest blow for Flonnie was seeing the marriage finally crumble. Years of her life had been wasted. Time she could never get back. For Blanche, something inside her broke seeing her mother devastated by the loss of a man who inflicted pain and suffering on everyone around him. But then something unexpected happened. Blanche seemed to have a change of heart. Upon learning where her father was staying, she decided to visit with him for the sole purpose of making peace. What she found was a man so battered by alcohol and age that he was nothing more than a shriveled-up shell of himself. Blanche couldn't help but think how helpless he looked. The house was filthy, he reeked of alcohol, and there was no sign of the young women he'd abandoned his family to chase after, and she felt absolutely no sympathy for him. But she committed herself to visiting with him as often as she could, bringing him hot home-cooked meals, fresh juice, and baked goods. On her days off from work she would pour coffee and sit with him. Every time she visited, PD looked as if he had one foot in the grave and the other foot was slipping. He stopped eating completely and was barely able to swallow any of the liquids she gave him. He begged for a doctor, and Blanche would tell him that the doctor was coming soon, but that never happened. Instead, she took pleasure in watching him die. Somehow she knew the world would be a better place without PD Kaiser in it, and she was happy that she had some part in making it happen. When he took his last breaths, Blanche stood over him with a smile. She wanted her face to be the last one he saw as he slipped away to hell. After 2 decades, the marriage to James Taylor had run its course. Blanche had become disconnected from her husband as her affair with Raymond Reed intensified. She no longer wanted to play the role of loving wife. She watched her mother do it for years and was determined to not let the same thing happen to her. The death of her father had no emotional impact. She felt no regret, instead seeing it as a necessary evil. She was now at a crossroad with her husband. James had been Blanche's escape from her father's house, but the marriage quickly turned into another hell she was forced to endure with years of abuse, gambling, and drinking. When James suffered a near-fatal heart attack, there was a glimmer of hope that she would finally be free of him. But somehow he had managed to pull through. It was then she knew what had to be done. It was as clear as it was with PD. Blanche's only hesitation was knowing that her daughters would mourn the loss of their father, something she would never want them to experience because of her actions. But she knew what had to be done. It was another necessary evil that couldn't be avoided. The brush with death had changed her husband, and he tried desperately to make things right with her, but it was too late. Before long, James began to complain of stomach pains, something Blanche brushed off as a flu bug. She gave him medicine to soothe him enough to help him sleep through the night, but by morning he was crying out in agony and begging Blanche to call the doctor. But they were already overwhelmed with bills from his stay in the hospital following his heart attack, and they couldn't afford to have a doctor come to the house. James's weight made it impossible for Blanche and their daughters to get him to the car. She did her best to nurse him at home, caring for him while still working full-time. One of their daughters would stay with him until she returned home from work or if she went to spend time with Reed. After the death of her husband, Blanche and Raymond Reed began to date openly. Although they had been seeing each other for well over a decade, Blanche had no interest in taking things further. Reed was transferred to another store in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and the strain of the distance along with Blanche's unwillingness to move with him began to cause tension between them. It was during this time that she began dating Robert Hutton, the regional manager of the store where she worked. However, when rumors began circulating that Hutton had a girl in every store he managed, Blanche ended the relationship and filed a sexual harassment lawsuit. The store settled the case out of court and forced Hutton to resign. Blanche spent New Year's Eve with Raymond Reed despite the cooling down of their relationship. The next day, Reed began experiencing severe symptoms of nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea after eating some of Blanche's homemade potato soup. His condition continued to worsen, causing him to miss months of work until finally he was admitted to Wesley Long Hospital in Greensboro, North Carolina, on May 30, 1986. His physician, Dr. Norman Garrett Jr., said Reed reported he had become violently ill after eating dinner a week earlier. He explained the symptoms he had experienced and told Garrett that he had not been able to keep down any solid foods since that time. Dr. Garrett initially diagnosed Reed with acute gastroenteritis based on the symptoms he'd reported. But as Reed's condition continued to deteriorate, Garrett changed his diagnosis from acute gastroenteritis to multiple systems failure. Reed's symptoms had substantially progressed and now included skin rash, edema, dehydration, bone marrow damage, blood cell abnormalities, electrolyte abnormality, progressive shortness of breath, respiratory failure, a fast heartbeat, low blood pressure, kidney malfunction and failure, as well as numbness and tingling in his hands and feet. The situation was touch and go for several days, with an uncertainty as to whether he would survive, and Garrett brought the family together to prepare them for the worst. But by June 5, 1986, Reed's condition had miraculously improved. All the while Blanche had been there by his side, pretending to nurse him back to health. Everyone was amazed at her dedication to Reed, telling him how lucky he was to have Blanche by his side throughout the whole ordeal. With his condition improving, Dr. Garrett told Reed that he may be well enough to go home in just a few days. In fact, the only reason Reed had to remain in the hospital was because of the circumcision that was performed due to an infection that had developed. However, Reed took a turn for the worse and had to be transferred to North Carolina Baptist Hospital in Winston-Salem, North Carolina on June 15, 1986. Doctors were mystified about the cause of the multi-system failures he was experiencing. It was noted that Reed had been admitted with a number of symptoms, including a raspy voice, severe swelling in his lower extremities, anemia, low white blood cell count, a rash over his lower extremities, white patches in his mouth, very poor bowel function, difficulty breathing, and signs of kidney failure. On June 21, 1986, medical staff rushed to Reed's room after a call for code blue was announced over the intercom. Once resuscitated, he was intubated and placed on a ventilator. Over the next few days, Reed became nearly paralyzed. Dr. Hamilton, one of the specialists assigned to Reed's care, determined that Reed had Guillain-Barré syndrome and ordered a plasma transfusion. Reed showed some slight improvement following the procedure, but he was still not out of the woods yet. A subsequent lab report from a urine sample obtained from Reed showed he had significantly elevated levels of arsenic in his system. Unfortunately, none of the medical staff ever saw the results of the lab report. Over time, Reed regained use of his arms and legs and was able to be taken off the ventilator. Blanche was allowed to resume bringing food from home for Reed, and by the end of September, Reed suffered another serious setback. He never recovered. Reed's son recalled visiting his father in the hospital, hardly recognizing him. He was bloated, looking as though he'd gained 100 pounds, and with swollen eyeballs and splitting skin. Once again, he was placed on a ventilator, and doctors knew there was little they could do to keep him alive. Raymond Reed died on October 7, 1986 at 50 years old. Blanche insisted that an autopsy not be performed, claiming Reed would never want his body to be cut open in such a way. Before his death, Raymond Reed had transferred power of attorney to Blanche. He had left her all of his property, leaving nothing to his sons, and had also given her access to share in the proceeds from his life insurance policy. Blanche met Reverend Dwight Moore while embroiled in her lawsuit against the grocery store where she worked and while she was still in a relationship with Raymond Reed. Moore, a widower, was the pastor of Carolina United Church of Christ. He was a pillar of the community and was respected by his congregation. He quickly fell under her spell, but she convinced him that they couldn't openly see each other because it would debunk the claims in the lawsuit that she was left traumatized by the sexual harassment she endured. But after the lawsuit was settled and Reed's death, Blanche began publicly dating Dwight Moore. Soon after, he proposed and the two were married. But it would seem bad luck followed Blanche like a shadow. By the time she and her husband returned from their honeymoon, he was already sick and barely able to function. Moore's condition quickly went from bad to worst, and he was admitted to the hospital with a mysterious disease. Blanche assumed the role of caring spouse, as she had with her husband, James, and Reed, her longtime boyfriend. Doctors worked tirelessly to determine the cause of Moore's debilitating illness, and were frustrated by their inability to do so. Blanche, at the time, remained steadfast by her husband's side, rarely leaving the hospital. Moore's prognosis looked grim, despite signs of improvement that were followed by severe symptoms that left him weak and exhausted. Doctors were baffled until Blanche mentioned that her husband had been working with pesticides around their home prior to becoming sick. Desperate for answers, they ran a toxic screening. What they found caused both disbelief and horror. Dwight Moore had arsenic in his system, 20 times the lethal level. Doctors knew the poison had to have been given to him by someone close to him before and/or during his hospital stay. This new revelation was the beginning of the end for Blanche. Hospital staff notified law enforcement and immediately put security outside Reverend Moore's room. Not even Blanche was allowed to enter, and doctors were being tight-lipped about their findings. Her demands to see her husband and subsequent legal threats were settled when detectives arrived at the hospital to question her. Upon hearing the news that her husband had been given lethal doses of arsenic and they suspected it was someone close to him, Blanche gave a stellar performance and detectives played along with her charade. Prosecutors worked behind the scenes to find out all they could about Blanche Taylor Moore, the kind and considerate wife of a preacher. To those close to her, She was a sweet grandmother who spent her time at church helping her husband or with her grandchildren. But another side of Blanche soon surfaced, and it was ugly. It wasn't the affairs in which she engaged in while married, or the trumped-up accusations of sexual harassment that piqued law enforcement's interest. It was the question of whether there were other victims who were poisoned by her. One name came up almost immediately: Raymond Reed. After hearing about the circumstances of Reed's death, prosecutors got a court order to exhume his body. The body was taken to the medical examiner's office in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and an autopsy was performed. During the autopsy, the medical examiner immediately recognized the white lines across the fingernails of both hands. Results of the toxicology report indicated Reed's liver tissue contained lethal amounts of arsenic. His brain tissue contained approximately 67 times the amount of arsenic that would normally be found in a non-exposed individual. Based on these findings, the chief medical examiner for the state of North Carolina concluded that Raymond Reed died as a result of the complications of arsenic poisoning. Additional analysis of Reed's hair indicated he had been exposed to multiple ingestions of arsenic over an extended period of time. A warrant was issued for Blanche's arrest for the murder of Raymond Reed. Later, more bodies were exhumed and tested. Her first husband James Taylor, mother-in-law Isla Taylor, and her father, Parker Davis Kaiser, were all found to have lethal levels of arsenic. During her trial, the state introduced several witnesses who heard Blanche inquire about a specific pesticide used to kill ants. One witness even testified that he had bought the pesticide for Blanche at her request. Prosecutors theorized that Blanche hated men as a result of her horrendous childhood at the hands of her father. In her own defense, Blanche took the stand and denied the accusations levied against her. Ultimately, the jury found her guilty of the first-degree murder of Reed. During sentencing, the jury found as aggravating circumstances that Reed's murder was committed for monetary gain, as Blanche received both property and a share of the insurance benefits after his death. They cited the murder as being especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. However, they acknowledged how well she raised and provided for her children as they were growing up. She was credited for surrendering herself peacefully to law enforcement when she learned about the warrant for her arrest. She was also a well-respected member of her community who demonstrated concern and kindness for others. With all things considered, the jury recommended that Blanche be sentenced to death. Blanche Taylor Moore remains on death row, by now well into her 90s. She still maintains her innocence.